read question 1 from what Lee had provided, and then I'll read the rest of the questions that you and I, that the 3 of us came up with. Uh-oh, now I lost your sound.
No, we're here.
Oh, okay.
I think we're live streaming.
Yes, it looks like we're live.
Well, I ruined the surprise. I'm sorry.
Okay. I will let you all go. Oh, what is wrong? It says now my audio needs to render. What in the world? It's like we had no trouble like yesterday with this. Okay, let me create a new live and we'll go from there. Because I think it's not.
We're not going with any of these
Okay. I think we are live now.
Yes, I think so.
Okay. I will give you the reins over, Esperanza. Sorry for all the technical difficulties. I'll update the link wherever I need to update, and then we can get started.
All right, great.
Let me give you host before I go, Esperanza.
Okay, I'm the host now. Okay. So I'll just go ahead and start us off and introduce myself. So hello, everyone. My name is Esperanza Vargas Macias. I am the Vice President of the Graduate Student Association. Before we start, we'd like to do a land acknowledgement. Northern Michigan University is located on the ancestral homelands of the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy, an honored alliance of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. Before this land was called Marquette, it was known as Giizhik, Namibini, Sibing. So, thank you. Welcome to the closing events for the 25th Annual Celebration of Student Scholarship. The Celebration of Student Scholarship is an annual event held at Northern Michigan University to celebrate the scholarship and creativity of both undergraduate and graduate students in all disciplines. Students share their work with the NMU and Marquette communities by presenting posters, delivering oral presentations, sharing visual art installations, and submitting essays on scholarly and creative work. The event is free and open to the public. This is our first year going virtual. If you are only here for the speakers and haven't checked out the student research and scholarship, you can do so by visiting the website at the bottom of the video description. The website will give you direction on how to enter NMUV campus, which is the virtual world for this event. To close out this event, we brought in 2 scholars to talk about their research. If you walked around the NMUV campus, you will see that we have created the space to welcome these 2 speakers. This talk is taking place in the Giizhik Lake Superior Lecture Hall. It's not often that we get to hear voices from the field that work directly with Native American communities. Tonight, we will get to hear these scholars talk candidly about their work, research, and the stories, places, and people who inspire them. This portion of the event is brought to you by the McNair Scholar Program, Center for Native American Studies, and the NMU Graduate Student Association. Facilitating the talk between the 2 scholars tonight is Amber Moorsaw, the Director of the Center for Native American Studies at NMU. Allow me to briefly introduce Amber. Amber Moorsaw is the director of the Center for Native American Studies at Northern Michigan University. As a director, she applies her knowledge and passion for student and community growth by supporting faculty autonomy in the classroom, supporting student-led initiatives, and providing research bridges and opportunities between academia and tribal communities. As a Pokagon Band citizen Potawatomi, she is happy to be working with Anishinaabe students at home in the UP and carries all she has learned from her students and mentors in South Dakota close to her heart. Her time at South Dakota State University brought a lot of growth and inspiration to go beyond programming and recruitment to conduct research to promote cultural connectedness to science in her project, Storytelling Through Science, using oral history and chemistry to revitalize quill working societies, a project focusing on decolonizing curriculum in tribal schools and the rematrination of traditional knowledge and contemporary education with Dr. Sharity Bassett, and is the newest board member of the Michigan Indian Education Council. So before I hand it over to Amber to introduce our speakers, please remember that you can send questions to our speakers via the link in the description below the YouTube video. Thank you. So go ahead.
Bonjour, Manoa Giizhik, Amber Morsa, Indigenous Mishike and Dodam, Potawatomi and Dao, Pukeganik and Demindagwis. Hello, everyone. Today is a good day. My name is Amber Morsa, and I'm a Pokagon Band citizen, Potawatomi Nation. And it is my honor and pleasure to introduce my two of my dearest friends and colleagues from South Dakota State University, Dr. Sharity Bassett and Dr. Erica J. Moore. Dr. Erica Moore is Borican Taino and a member of the United Confederation of Taino People. She has a PhD in higher education leadership, a master's and bachelor's degree in history. She serves as the director of the American Indian Student Center at South Dakota State University. Before coming to SDSU, she was at Lower Brule Tribal College as the chief academic officer. She has worked in education for over 10 years, teaching history and political courses. Her research focuses upon Native American student success. Additionally, she shares her expertise in culturally responsive practices through workshops in K-12 classrooms, museum networks, and medical facilities. She is joined by Dr. Sharity Bassett, Assistant Professor and Co-Coordinator of American Indian and Indigenous Studies at South Dakota State University. She is a scholar of Indigenous methodologies, literary analysis, and transfeminist theories. Her manuscript under contract with Michigan State Press examines how Haudenosaunee women lacrosse players shape definitions of tradition, medicine, and sovereignty in contested spaces. Dr. Bassett's present research collaborations are centered around Oceti Shakowee and Anishinaabe quill work, digital story mapping based on oral histories, and gender and parenthood in the workplace during a global pandemic. I know they won't be able to see you, but please help me welcome Dr. Bassett and Dr. Moore as we start to talk a little bit about their research in Indigenous communities. So to kick us off a little bit, I'd like to have you invite us into your classroom. What does this space look like? How do you cultivate learning? What does this look like? What are the smells? What are the sounds? We really want to be immersed into your teaching environment.
You go first? You want me to go first?
I'll let you go first.
Okay, I'll go first. Okay, so lately, my classroom smells like whatever my office or home smells like, because I've been doing a lot of teaching over Zoom, as most of us have. But what I try to, I actually can't teach my classes in a classroom that would have a social.
Hi everyone, if you're here for the presentation, I updated the YouTube link for it. If you can't find it, you should be able to enter the new YouTube link by clicking X in the space, and the YouTube link should lead you to the new tab for that. But I think most of you found it. Can I get a thumbs up from Scott Rose if you're able to find the YouTube link? Thank you, Scott.
Ready?
Okay.
Okay, so as I was saying, I'm not really able to effectively teach the courses that I teach in a classroom where we have to social distance, because my pedagogy is around community-based and team-based learning. So there's some things that students will learn from me. Most of it they will learn from the materials that I choose and from each other. So right now, the courses I've been teaching, I've been doing a lot of breakout rooms and, making sure that that students are interacting with one another, because the content that I teach is pretty challenging. I'll speak specifically about just one class, which is American Indian Studies 211. It's South Dakota American Indian Culture and Education, and it's a course that anybody who plans to teach in South Dakota in a K through 12 public school has to take a course like this. And so SDSU, Black Hills State, and USD all teach a course to total about 1,000 students every year. And it's a way for future teachers, and in some cases current teachers, to gain some confidence in bringing Oceti Sakowin culture and language into their classrooms. But the requirement ends there. In other words, after they take a class like this, they do not, teachers are not required at a state level to bring Oceti Sakowin culture and language into their classes. Like for instance, in North Dakota and Montana, it's required in Montana and it's incentivized in North Dakota. And we see similar raises in graduation rates for American Indian students. But South Dakota, the requirement ends with just the class. And so my job then becomes in this class is to compel mostly non-Indigenous future teachers to bring it into their classroom, because they care through the materials that they've read, through the relationships that they've built, and it's the right thing to do. So that's what my classroom looks and smells like right now.
Well, I left teaching 2 years ago, so I'll just speak to what my space, the American Indian Student Center here, feels and smells like, and what you can typically see. It's really important for us here at the center to make this a space where our students feel just like they're at home. And so you often will smell cooking right now. Someone's in there making Indian tacos. So you smell, as they joked, burning oil, but also the delicious smells of the making of the fry bread. On any given day, you'll smell whatever it is we're choosing to smudge, whether it's, the sweetgrass, sage. So those lingering smells down the hall can be smelled. And then we are just always here with our students. Our students are just, they're either studying, they're either in there cooking and eating with us. We have an open door policy. At any given time, they can come into my office and sit down. I've had students say it was just the space they felt the safest. And so I let them sit there. We didn't talk. I did my work. They studied, which is amazing. I want them to feel that way. They do that with my staff as well. And so I'd just like to think that you would come into the center and you would see us engaging the same way we would with our relatives at home. And so that's the place that we built here at SDSU.
It smells amazing in here right now.
It does.
I'm so jealous. I can just imagine the smells that are coming through those hallways, both the smudge and that burnt oil smell, right? So as we talk a little bit about creating these spaces for our students in the academic sense, but also in the student affairs sense, I really have to ask, how do you work together? How does student services and academic affairs work together to inspire and set these parameters for inviting Native students and communities to do research with you?
That's a great question. We work together a lot. Maybe I'll start off by talking about how we work to protect students together.
Sure. I think too, maybe we just start with how Wokini is sort of the holistic approach that SDSU chose to take. And that just means the three really strong sort of prongs of that are the AIS department, and then obviously the student center, and then the tribal relations aspect of the director of Wokini. And so we work together regularly and speak regularly. But I think, as Sharity was about to explain, and I'll let her, some of the things that we do tackle together, and one of them is advocacy for our students.
Yeah, so I'll start off with just a quick example of how we work together with student success and student research. Coming up next week, we have a symposium that the Student Center in Wokoni and the American Indian Studies program are putting on together to celebrate the opening of this amazing building. And it's being kicked off by a student panel, American Indian students who have research to talk about that. They're involved in these research projects, and that is student success right there. And that's something that we do a lot of in our major and our minor. Is we're small. Right now we have 16 minors and 3 majors. And so my colleagues and I are able to really work pretty closely with each student on their research trajectories. And so that's pretty fun. But one of the ways that we have to advocate for American Indian students is in some ways because of this initiative, the Wokoni initiative, which incentivizes pretty heavily and pretty strongly at our university that faculty from all over the university work with American Indian students and work with American Indian communities in their research, which is a good thing in and of itself. But of course, because of just a history with how colonization has played out for communities, for American Indian communities, and how information has been extracted and then misrepresented, there's a lot of caution around that. And so the Wokoni initiative invites American Indian students into this space. And so one of the things that we have to do a lot of work around is teaching and educating different places in the university of how to effectively and responsibly and ethically work with American Indian students in ways that are not going to be exploitative and in ways that really value long-term relationships and are not just helicopter projects kind of in and out.
Yeah, I think an example very specifically, we have a Wokoni Challenge grant process. So if faculty want to engage in that type of research, it often includes the tribal communities and our Indigenous students. And so they have to first meet with me to discuss their proposal. We work through it. I try to sort of weed out the areas that may be more problematic and then educate them on why. So I don't just say this is inappropriate. I discuss it with them and explain why it's inappropriate. And then I help them change it or amend it so that it is, a better overall proposal, and then obviously does not exploit our students or the communities in any way, and then maintaining that data sovereignty with the tribes and the students, and ensuring that if a student is working in that project, they're building skill sets, they're able to benefit from it, and then it passes off to Dr. Bassett, and she will have a workshop on Indigenous methodology where we talk to them about those more appropriate ways to engage in their research once it is approved or their proposals approved. So that's one way that we work together as student affairs and academic affairs. Another really great project that we are working together. I am now obviously not on the research side of it as I'm in student affairs, but I've been brought onto the Quill Project workshop to essentially support, consult, and provide networking to connect the pieces and where to obtain the original historical Quill pieces. We've included our doctoral students. So there's just so many ways that we ensure that we stay engaged with one another.
Yeah, and I'm gonna just have to give a shout out to Amber because, of course, this idea came from Amber. So a couple of years ago, we invite quill worker, Dakota quill worker, Laverne White Bear to SDSU to do a presentation and to do a tiny little workshop. And so students got to kind of get their hands on some quills and feel what it's like to flatten them and start some of the applique. And Amber was present there, and part of what Laverne talked about is the dyeing process and wanting to get back to the kind of the original ways of dyeing, the natural ways of dyeing. And so Amber, you know, being in, always having her eye on a number of different areas, kind of thought about a doctoral student, a Lakota doctoral student, Derek Brandes, in chemistry, and how he might be able to help with some of the aspects of figuring out how to dye. And then Amber having her eye on education, thinking about how we could have some lesson plans going into schools that would help make things like chemistry and the sciences really relevant in the classroom for Indigenous students. So that's Amber's brainchild, and we're still kind of plugging away at that process. COVID has, you know, limited our ability to go places, but we are planning to go to Pier in a week or two, I guess 3 weeks, to pick up some samples, some historic samples, and have Derek Brandes, you know, work on the dyes and things like that. So that's a really fun project. But I definitely wanted to name that this was Amber's brainchild.
She never lets me go too far for to remember, you know, my spot in that project. And you know, it was a really cool experience to be able to work with you all in collaborating and getting this project, the ball rolling on this project. And so in addition to that, and what you all were seeing in the different areas that you work in, it really feels like it is a decolonized approach to do no harm, right? So what does this look like? What does this do no harm mentality look like in Indigenous communities? And then what's the difference in working with Indigenous communities versus working with non-Indigenous communities?
Great question.
It is a great question.
Let's start. Sure. So the first part of that, just to clarify, was well, just say it again.
Right. So in reflecting in what you were saying and then reflecting in the project that we were just referring to, it feels like do no harm, like a do no harm medical model, but in an academic research kind of sense. So what does this mean with working with Indigenous communities, and how does it differ from working with other communities?
So for the first half of that, I'll say this, and not just for this project, but anytime I'm engaging in learning myself, you know, since I was little, and then obviously going to school for this work, when I attempt to examine whether I'm reading about a certain topic, I like to ask a few questions. You know, who's telling this story? Who are they talking about? And who are the audience intended? And that's meaningful for Indigenous research, because we're often told, we're talked about in research from the colonizer's lens, I like to call it, right? And so, for example, Taino people, we were the first to encounter Columbus. And when you, as researchers, are studying history or researching colonization and the impacts, oftentimes when you hear our story, it's told through who was Columbus, what did he do, what did he do to us, and what happened to him after. And very, very limited do people ever hear about who we were. And so I, as a researcher, likes to go into that for any topic. Who's telling the story? Is it through the historically excluded lens of those individuals that they're talking about? And so with Indigenous communities, that's how I start it with everything, any project, any research project. I dissect it. I don't necessarily deconstruct, but I reconstruct the story that's being told and the language used when telling it, to ensure that all perspectives, especially the Indigenous perspective, is included. And so oftentimes, while I don't view decolonize as a wrong term, I like to think of it as we're indigenizing and reconstructing what has already been put out there through the dominant culture and the colonizers' research. And we're now being able to tell our own stories through that research. So that's the first half of that. And I'll let you talk to that too.
So I don't really have a relation. I need to kind of give a caveat that I don't have a relationship with that term "do no harm" necessarily, because I'm not in the medical field. I know I've heard it and I know where it comes from, but I don't want to offend anybody with what I'm about to say, which feels like it's kind of a low bar. I mean, it seems like the very least that we can do when I apply it specifically to research, especially with working with Indigenous communities. It feels like the bare minimum. And when I hear the term "do no harm," what I think of next is our institution's internal review boards that we go through so that we don't harm. Anytime you're going to work with, human subjects, I hate that term, subjects. Anytime you're going to work with people, you have to, or animals and some other reasons, but you have to go through this internal review board, of course. And that's good and helpful. And also sort of the relationship that many academics have to that is, what's the least I can do to pass this? Okay. And one of the methods that I engage in for my research is oral history. And oral history is actually not part of the national definition of research, which means that in many cases, if you want to do oral histories, you don't have to go through an internal review board unless you plan to do like upwards of 100 of them, and there might be some generalizable information that you get from it. Which means that within the very recent past, somebody from our institution interviewed a minor, an Indigenous child, without that person's parents giving consent, the community giving consent. So that's I think where "do no harm" fails Indigenous communities. If you work with internal review boards that are in place within Indigenous communities, the bar is much higher than what you find in institutions like SDSU or where I graduated from at University of Buffalo. And so, since, if we really want to engage in Indigenous methodologies and work ethically at a high standard with Indigenous communities, we have to go with the standards that are in place in communities.
And then I guess the second part of that question, right, was what's the difference between like conducting research? Is that where we're going with that? The difference between Indigenous communities and non? Well, of course, there's the historical part. Forced assimilation, appropriation, using research as a way to exploit. Researchers oftentimes go into communities, and let's just, for example, the tribal communities in South Dakota, not all of them have their own institutional review board. So an individual, if they go to one of those tribes and take advantage of that, they can do any research they want and say, well, there was no institutional review board. And so they can do that research and then take it with them. And so now that separates those Indigenous communities from the information and data that was collected on them. Oftentimes you see non-Indigenous researchers not including Indigenous people in the research, meaning they're just the subjects. They're not often participating as researchers. They aren't published when those non-Indigenous researchers use that information to then become published. And so because of that, it's important that we take those steps to ensure that we're not doing those things, which could lend way to that "do no harm." We shouldn't want to do harm in any research, but taking into consideration that context of what has always happened in the past and even still happening today, just differently, right? And I think that's the difference, is that historically it has been Indigenous communities or other historically included communities, and this is not occurring in the same way to the dominant culture, the non-Indigenous individuals or communities.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything more to add. That was so eloquently put, but maybe just an example of, I'll name at this point that I am a non-Indigenous person. And so my research with Indigenous communities is as a non-Indigenous person. And I have a lovely example of how this kind of plays out, and the importance and the role of limits that Indigenous people put around information. And that is just that in one of my interviews for my manuscript, I sat down with somebody who really did not want to be in that interview, but had agreed to it, and under some certain a certain set of circumstances. And in the middle of the interview, when I asked a question about something that was off limits for her, she said, "I am not going to talk about that." And I was slow on the uptake. I was nervous, and so I asked another question about that same thing, and she said, she looked at me and said, "I just told you I'm not going to talk about that." And then let me know, researchers come into our space, exactly what you just said. Researchers come into our space and they want to take our information and then they feel like it belongs to them. It's now theirs and they can do what they want with it. And that was a really important limit. We sat there for a good minute and then kind of slowly moved back into the space of talking, and she then talked to me about 2 hours. She talked to me for 2 hours about things that she wanted to talk to me about, things that she was willing to share with me and let me, it was a gift, an absolute gift, but the boundary around that. And I think that is incredibly important with Indigenous, working with Indigenous communities. That's something that I've actually learned to look for. I look for the boundary. Please tell me what the boundary is. It's just a helpful way not to cause harm.
That was a really powerful statement that I want to point out there, that this knowledge that you are gaining from these communities is a gift. I think that's so important to the narrative, because we have to consider what traditional ways of knowing the significance is to the community and to the person that we are doing research with or doing research on. And so keeping that in mind, we have to acknowledge that academia has not had a very positive stance in Native American communities. And so what can you talk about where we are now with this huge push from Native communities to acknowledge the accountability of academia's hand in forced removal, assimilation, and ultimately genocide of Native people? How has your work in these respected areas changed the narrative, and how do you see that coming through in your teachings in your students?
Well, that's a giant question.
I can break it down. I know that was a whole lot. So first, I guess, where are we now? Where are we now in this space to do research with Indigenous communities while also considering academia's hand in the assimilation and genocide of Native Americans?
So I feel like I can speak to what we're doing on this campus. I think nationally, there's still a great deal of work that has to be done. At least the conversation is being had. So I will always welcome the conversation, obviously. But I think for SDSU, this was a huge step forward to create the initiative that is set to really help acknowledge and then mend all of the historical ways in which education has harmed Indigenous communities, doing it in a very thoughtful way across campus. So we're creating, as Sharity had mentioned, excuse me, Dr. Bassett, that we have created workshops and training. We're not just bringing the students to this institution, but we're ensuring that the institution is going to be conducive to their learning. And that requires a very culturally responsive campus. We help educate and train non-Indigenous people across campus, those departments. The initiative creates and builds and collaborates with the tribal communities, which is where the research part comes in. And then obviously, we make those connections with the students and their family, and we include them, because there will always be anxiety for Indigenous parents, grandparents, aunties, uncles sending off their children to an institution which literally represents that intersection of when their culture was being ripped apart. And so it's tough and it takes time, and we have to do it. And I think that's why SDSU is doing this, and not to say we've never been this way, where we're already doing well, but to show and acknowledge that we may have done this in the past, and we are going to take the effort that it will require to make it the way we know that it should be.
Mm-hmm. So I think what I observe in teaching this class to future teachers, many of them come in with some resistances, not all of them, and not even half of them, but a certain percentage come into the space with some resistances, like, oh my goodness, is my country going to be, slammed? Is, am I going to be forced to think about diversity? And maybe I don't want to think about diversity and these kinds of things. So, but what I find is that the overall sentiment in 211 in this class is disappointment. As they move through the semester, there's disappointment in the K through 12 educational system that failed them, because why is it now the first time that they're hearing about the history of American Indian boarding schools that's not that old? Why is it now that they're just hearing about this? Why did they stop learning about American Indian people after 1900? Why did they never hear about termination, relocation, right, assimilation, any of these things? It's all so, every semester, it's like I'm astonished watching them be astonished every semester. And, I think we get to a place in the semester where probably 80% of them have come along. 16 to 20% just dig their heels in, right? But the majority of students really kind of come along and make some commitments, like, I'm going to bring this into my classroom. But then they move into spaces that are institutionalized, like the K through 12 system, that is, the default is not to see and understand Indigenous peoples as contemporary. That is the stream that they're swimming up against. And so I think where we are now, like from my vantage point with these students in the state, is that there's a lot of individual desire for change and for things to be better, and people want to be part of the solution, and people generally want to care, but institutions end up getting in the way of that. And I think, to Dr. Moore's point with SDSU, like, this is an inherently racist institution. It's built on stolen land. Like, it's just already a problematic space. It's already a current against which you have to bring in cultural competency. At an individual level, we both meet lots and lots of people who want to see this go well for students. But at an institutional level, that's harder, I think.
So the second part to that question is how has your work specifically changed this narrative of these inherently racist institutions? Dr. Bassett, you talked a little bit about it, and Dr. Moore, if you could expand a little bit more on the work that you do specifically.
I would like to think that my work is changing things, but I don't want to assume, or I don't want to, speak to it that my work alone is changing things. Especially because we collaborate so often in these spaces. But I think, when I started doing this work, I would go out and teach or, help educators K through 12 create culturally responsive classrooms, how to have difficult conversations. I've done it for museum organizations, for curating culturally responsibly. Medical facilities in this state, I've provided that training for. And so I feel as an individual who definitely has a great deal of privilege, because I do present differently than my father and siblings and relatives. I feel like I have a responsibility to do this work, and so I do that outside of my teaching and the work here on campus. I do that. But here on campus, as we mentioned a little bit about that, we still reach out and do that across campus. One of the hardest things for us here is the student advocacy, because we are often in this situation where we see it happening in and out of the classroom on this campus, and I'm sure across all campuses. And so being sure that when my students come to me and say this is happening, they know someone is going to try to do something. And so no matter how small or large, I feel like that's something that I do in this work, and try to do actively every day, be that person for my students. And then where I see those problems, follow up to educate those who created the problems for our students. So hopefully it's impacting.
I know it's impacting. I just spoke with two students, though Dr. Moore, Dr. Moore was out of this room, who said, I've seen such a huge improvement here in the last 4 years. So,
oh, that's good. That's good. Love to hear it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to answer your part.
Oh, she said I already did.
Oh, okay. Go on then.
Oh, I mean, if you wanted to say more, but to also kind of contest about this, the changes that SDSU has made. Leaving South Dakota was not easy, because we had created a space for our students that felt like family, right? They were our Hunka relatives, right? And so, or our Teoshbe. And so I feel personally, now being an outside looking in, I really do feel that you all have created a wonderful space for those students to come into, to feel supported. And so I feel like I left it in really, really, really good hands, because you all were able to kind of mentor not only myself, but those students that were coming in, to be able to continue on with their education and achieve greater things. So it's definitely working. So my next question, to kind of bridge these two together, is just that. How does your work together support student research and overall success? I know that this is kind of covered through your work individually, but together, how does that come through?
I don't think I could do the work I do without the center and Dr. Moore. I mean, that's a hard question to answer, because we have it. Yeah. We have the collaboration, but maybe we can speak to like the process of building the collaboration.
Yeah, I'll say this. I feel, obviously I've worked at PWI campuses before, tribal colleges. I think that this relationship and the collaboration has been so meaningful for me, because every day I feel, just existing and doing the work in this space, you have to advocate, whether it's small or large, or you see it, or it's covert. We're constantly advocating for ourselves, our staff, our colleagues, our students. And so it makes it so much easier, besides just the research work that we do, when we see something happening, because the story that she just told about that Indigenous youth being interviewed came to my door first. And I was like, I need to say this to someone that's going to understand and hear it. And so Dr. Bassett and her spouse, Dr. Freeland, who are the co-coordinators, are often the two that I reach out to first. Here's the problem. What do we do from here? And I think that shows the relationship part of that, and that allows us to really be creative and open with the research that we do. And often, while, as I mentioned before, I left academic affairs aside, so I'm not often the researcher alone, I am brought into a good bit of their projects, even if it's to just discuss the use of the students throughout the project, meaning we have student researchers and all of those ways that we can just work it out with each other and have each other to do that work with is really important for me.
Yeah, it's definitely a pipeline. That's a terrible word to use. I have this no pipeline T-shirt, but it's a quick, so traditionally, and I think this is maybe why your question, why you have the question and why it's such an important question, right? So traditionally, academic affairs and student affairs are siloed, and there's nothing in our job description, there's nothing in my job description, there's nothing structurally that says I have to work with the center, which to me is just mind-blowing. I hope that changes. Like, I think we're advocating to have that actually be an official structure, because we don't have to work together. But when stuff goes down, and it goes down all the time, we have to have that avenue to one another. I looked at my spouse's phone the other day and saw that Dr. Moore is the person he calls the most. we are constantly on the horn.
It's usually often you too,
That's
using
true.
his phone to call me.
And so, like, we should just have a three-way, like a speed dial here. And just another quick example, a student who's a major, an Indigenous student who's an AIS major, who's doing research with us, kind of sitting in a lounge pre-COVID, having a conversation about the research, and then is approached by somebody who's looking very actively for Indigenous students to interview, to pull stories from, and kind of approaching it in a pretty problematic way, because there was a deadline, right? There's a timeline, and those two things are really hard to put together. And so the first place I go after that happens is over to the center to talk to both of you. I think we both, Dr. Freeland and I both came over there to say, okay, how do we make sure that the student is protected, and students who are invited into this project are protected?
I think too, one last thing that I'll add on, like, a more positive, is that oftentimes as people doing the work in Indigenous communities, or the work that we do at the center or the AIS, someone will reach out. Oftentimes someone reaches out and they're like, hey, do you want to be a part of this project? And the first thing I do is, am I the right person for this? And then when I see, no, this might not be something that I should be doing, this seems more of a Dr. Bassett thing or a Dr. Freeland thing, or this seems more tribal relations. So I think every person should do that. Stop, look to see if it's your lane, you should even be doing it, and finding a way to connect them to the right people. And so oftentimes when it is something I shouldn't be doing, and I say that not like it's illegal for me to do it, but not appropriate for me to do it, I then reach out or connect the individuals, and they have done the same for me. So I think that happens all of the time with research projects, grants, and so that's sort of the processes that we go through for all of that.
But we had to build it.
Yes. But isn't that like apropos for what we're saying? create time to create the relationship.
Yeah, that's it.
And it's not just important for just the students too. You know, as you were talking about this, it seems like you've also created a space for yourselves. Dr. Bassett was talking about how academia is, or the academic side of the university is very siloed from the student affairs. And so, but through this collaboration, it really feels like you guys have created a support system for yourselves. And with Indigenous faculty, that can be Indigenous faculty and staff on either side of the university. It really feels like that could help mitigate some burnout because you're making those stronger connections. Do you have anything to say about that connection?
I mean, I agree 100%.
Like, anything to say about the burnout?
You know, just about this, through creating these different services and collaborations between the academic side and the student affairs side, you've created and fostered that relationship of support for your students. Do you have anything to say about the fostering and creation of support for yourselves or other Indigenous faculty by bridging these two?
Yeah, I think I'll just add, and then I'll let you go if you have more to say, but a few examples where I'm often tasked with trainings, and someone will call and say, can you present to this, present on this, or can you provide a training on this, or can you, and it's, we all have those other duties as assigned on our, job description. But sometimes and this is for student affairs and academic affairs, you can become overwhelmed with the amount of work, especially if you're in an identity-based center or department, and you have your regular work, and then you have your advocacy work and student in crises. It doesn't just end the day you help the student, but it carries this extra weight with you as you do the work. And so for me, I feel like we created a space where, okay, I can't do all this by myself, and I'm going to go to Sharity and Mark and see if they, have advice, guidance, can help pick up some slack. They've asked the same of me, or we get together and we meet often and say, what are we all doing that we can sort of work on together to alleviate some of that stress and the weight that holds us down every day while we're just trying to exist throughout the day and get through it. So that's what's super important to me. In one of the last meetings we had, I was asked to do something, and I said, I'll do it if Sharity and Mark help me. And so, yeah, I think that was important for us to build, not just for our students, but for ourselves too.
Yeah, some weeks feel more like survival than others. I love this narrative I'm going to share about the both of you. Teaching boarding schools is just a painful. It's hard every semester. We don't spend a ton of time in it into 11. But we do have one intensive week about it. We talk about it throughout, but we have one intensive week about it. And Mark and I share that. We do it together. Usually he can barely get through it without choking up. So, I'm usually there. And one semester he was having a particularly rough week, and we were about to head over to the art museum to teach the class. And I said, I got it. This time I got it. I was feeling like all strong. I'm good. And on my way over there, I said, oh my gosh, what have I done? And so I get over to my classroom, and I'm up front kind of prepping and preparing myself, deep breathing, thinking through how I'm going to talk about this. And I look out to the back of the classroom, and I see Dr. Moore and Amber sitting in the classroom just hanging out. And I was so excited to see them. And I went back, and I think you said, yeah, I think she saw us, or you said, I think she saw us.
She saw us.
And they were going to just sneak in. But you happened to be in the building for a meeting. You knew I was teaching at that time. So I went back to talk with you, and Amber, you asked, what are you teaching today? And I said, oh, we're talking about boarding schools. And your response was, yay. He said,
not in that way, but to be a part of a discussion.
Yeah. And he said, I think that might be a strange reaction, but it was just because we were talking about it. It's important because, wow, now we have another opportunity to bring our ancestors into the space. And so the two of you stayed and came up on the stage. It's a weird setup for a classroom, but there's like 100 students and we're up on the stage, and I just interviewed you about your families, and you called in your ancestors into that space and talked about their experiences with boarding schools. And it was like one of my most powerful class sessions. And that to me is like the epitome of how this relationship across academic affairs and student affairs plays out in the everyday.
It was good to be able to bring that energy to your classroom, because I remember that day too, and the yay boarding schools moment was not my most proud moment in the classroom, but it's important that we talk about those things, and that we rely on the energy of other folks to kind of help get us through some of those more difficult narratives. And it's very relevant to the holistic framework that we have in Native American studies and American Indian and Indigenous studies, is being there for your community to lift them up when we have to take on some of these more difficult, more challenging topics. So we have time for one more question before I open it up to Q&A. And this is everybody's favorite question, everything that's on everybody, or the one thing that's on everybody's mind. We've been about a year into the COVID-19 pandemic. How has this affected your research with Indigenous communities?
Well, immensely. Yeah, immensely. So I've got kind of two tracks happening simultaneously. The one, I've spent about a decade with Haudenosaunee communities. It's that project is kind of, I'm not going to say it's coming to an end, but the circle is kind of rounding. And because I've been involved in it for such a long time, COVID didn't matter that much for those relationships. Those relationships were already established. I could just, can you meet me over Zoom was not a challenging question to ask somebody you're already in relationship with, but that's not something that is useful to ask somebody you don't know that well. And what is the technology? So yeah, when I work with Oceti Shakopee people, the projects I've had have been put on hold. The checkpoints at Pine Ridge Reservation, I have a grant project that's focused on some plat maps, historic plat maps from their community, and working with the team I'm working with, anything we were going to do, in terms of do no harm. It was a non-Indigenous woman who went to California from Pine Ridge and brought it back to Pine Ridge, brought COVID back to Pine Ridge. So I mean, there's just no way we were going to go anywhere near that community during COVID and think that any kind of real long-term relationship could be established. So it's for me and working with Oceti Shakopee people, it's a matter of just patience and reaching out every once in a while, seeing how they're doing and seeing if they need anything.
Yeah, I think some of the more difficult pieces of this were many of the tribal communities in South Dakota are smaller. And so when they're experiencing relatives passing on due to COVID, it hits a little harder because you have a very small community and everyone knows everyone and they're related. And a really difficult piece was that it was often the elders, the memory keepers, the language keepers. So those things were emotionally and mentally, still are, difficult for so many in those communities. So you're trying to navigate those pieces of it while still trying to work with individuals that are in communities now that if certain workplaces are shut down and then they don't have Wi-Fi at home, they don't have laptops. And of course, not all Indigenous people and communities are homogenous, but so many in South Dakota do experience abject poverty, isolated from at a greater distance, farther away from access to many of those things. And so even if you have the relationships, you're still trying to kind of weed through the sadness, the grief, the unknown, what not to expect, or what to expect, and then the other issues of lack of access for the Zooming because they don't have it. If we're working with elders, many times they don't know how to Zoom. And just one more example, we are kind of working together to get the historical quill pieces. I reached out 7 months ago and they said, yes, come get them, but wait till after COVID. And then COVID's not ending. And so now we're at the point where it's like, well, come, but come in May because we'll all have our vaccines. And so even like smaller pieces like that have just put some of the research on hold. But I think it's the gravity of and the severity of how it's impacting, COVID is impacting Indigenous communities.
All right. Well, I would like to take this time to thank Dr. Bassett and Dr. Moore for joining us today. Thank you for sharing your experience and how we can really just work together and make things not so siloed, not only for our students, but for ourselves and for the betterment of academia. I think that by being able to listen to these narratives and learning from them, our students that are watching us here today can also make strides to advocate for themselves in these spaces, to help see a stronger collaboration between the academic side and student services side, not only for themselves, but also for future students. I really feel that after this presentation, I'm really hoping that our students will be able to take the information that they learned here, being able to do that respectful inquiry with our Anishinaabe communities here in the UP, but also if they travel to other Indigenous communities throughout the nation, that they still apply these same practices. And internationally too, we have Indigenous folks that are from all around the world. And so this knowledge is really applicable to just about anybody that you work with, because it really feels like from some of the things that we had discussed here, that it's people-centered, that this is a very person-first research methodology that can be applicable to not only Indigenous people, but also considering plants and animals as well, respecting those different life forms in whatever capacity that they come in. So I would like to thank you both, and I'm going to open up the chat for some questions. It looks like we have a couple of here, but if you are still online with us, I have put the link for the questions into the GatherTown chat. The link is also featured on the bottom of the YouTube link if you are joining us via YouTube, so that way you can ask questions of Dr. Moore and Dr. Bassett directly. So the first question that we have from our audience today is, how can other faculty members support you?
Support us?
Yes. Support the discipline, support this collaboration, I believe.
Always. So are we talking like the faculty here at SDSU?
Or faculty in general?
Faculty in general.
What does faculty collaboration or allyship look like?
Let's go with that one.
I always start with believe us and listen to learn. And so I think, oftentimes my advocacy, which will probably look different from Dr. Bassett's, there are times where I have to address issues with faculty members, directors, deans, and so far there's only ever really been one that was not willing to meet us where we were at. And so I think the really important thing for us at the center is that faculty are creating spaces in their classroom that are safe for all students and very importantly, including mine, of course, that's who I'm advocating for. And then on the other end, when you discover that someone might have been harmed, that you're always willing to listen, to learn so that it doesn't happen again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. Believe us, believe us, and listen to us. I think something I've noticed, and I'm a fairly new PhD. I just graduated in 2018. I'm a new faculty, and so some of this still feels pretty new to me. I taught as an adjunct for a lot of years, but that feels different than this. I think what I'm starting to notice is that I have a lot of colleagues who are interested in collaborating in research projects because of the discipline that I'm in, and because of the kind of the Wokeney initiative and the push and things like that. It's kind of a sexy topic right now, and so there's lots of people who want to collaborate. I'm starting to experience some of that helicopter approach. Like I'm interested, maybe like an interest in collaborating and working with this discipline for a couple of years, and I think maybe support and allyship looks like a longer term commitment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like I'm not saying that everybody needs to become American Indian Studies experts, or that I'm even close to being where I need to be with everything, but I am saying that Indigenous ways of knowing can inform every single discipline, but it's not going to happen in 2 years. It would be a decade long or a couple decades long commitment.
I'll just quickly add to that. Oftentimes, so I was academic affairs. I've taught for over a decade. I have been doing this work. I was a chief academic officer. I often have faculty approach me as someone they feel they just need so they can get the grant, but that there's nothing, like they don't see me as a partner in the work that is going to be able to give and create and help this grant project be something really great. I'm just a name that they can put on. And so oftentimes I'm even left out of the really, important details about a grant project. And so another way I have to always advocate for myself, but just please don't do that. I do have the credentials and the knowledge and the experience, and I can be a partner, and I am always willing. But sometimes when they approach it, I have to get this grant, and I need to say that I've been working with someone that fits this narrative. And so don't approach it that way.
Yeah, I very often feel like an add-on rather than a central piece of creating the project. For sure. Yeah.
Thank you for those comments. And I want to go back to this, the piece that Dr. Bassett had said about commitment, because it's very relevant to the 2 questions that are in the chat right now. So I'll read both of these questions because they're very similar. How should non-Indigenous folks approach working in Native communities is the first question. And the second question is, what are some techniques for collaborating with non-Indigenous people, groups, or institutions that approach you for collaboration, but are not as sensitive to the dignity of Indigenous individuals and community, or feel that it is okay to make so-called minor compromises for the sake of the study, institution, or company's profit or success in non-Indigenous communities? So the first question is, how should you work with Indigenous communities? And the second is collaborating and suggestions for folks who are resistant to such methodologies.
Okay, so I think I'm probably going to share examples and not really speak in a way like I'm lecturing, but oftentimes, and Dr. Bassett touched on one of these things, early on, but I'm often approached, hi, I'm doing this project. Can you connect me to a tribe? What does that mean? What do you mean connect you to the tribe? Do you want me to help create a relationship there. I can assist in giving you the connection of someone who could might be willing, but I can't hold your hand through the relationship process. And so I have people come, they ask for that, and then I help connect them, and they don't take the time to work on and build those relationships, and then they're angry at us. Why, you know, I needed help. I can't do this research without this relationship with this said tribe. And at other times, it's with students that they want on the project, and they'll say, well, I need Indigenous students to do this work. Well, our students don't need to do it. And so you can ask me for assistance, and I can set out to engage with the students to see if they're interested, but I'll never force them, and I'll never encourage them if they don't feel comfortable. We've asked individuals, come to our events, meet our students, engage with them, create relationships with them. So I think there's this piece of entitlement, that they, because you want to do the research, they should let you do the research, and that has to be removed from this work altogether. That just because you are trying to get your work published, or you have to finish your dissertation, or you want to get this grant, that any Indigenous person or any Indigenous community has to follow up. So I think first removing that, and then just obviously working to build those relationships, getting to know people, engaging, coming to our Wachipi or coming to our student events that they put on, showing that you support us on every day, not just the day you need us for your work. So well said.
Can you say that one more time, please?
No. Recorded. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Yes, support us every day, not just on the day that you.
Yes.
I think I would just add to that by, you know, that piece about building relationships. I haven't been able to articulate exactly what I mean, or what's meant by that necessarily, but some of it has to do, I think, with manners. And, you know, I think that in professional spaces and a lot of different spaces, we have sort of Euro-Western sets of protocols around answering email in a particular amount of time, or how often you can reach out to somebody when they haven't answered you, or whose obligation it is to answer you within a specific time, and what that means if they don't answer you within a specific time. And so all of the, and then how to, you know, open up a conversation for the first time, and these kinds of manners or lack of manners maybe that we you know have in our professional and academic spaces. And I think one of the major things that I learned, and it wasn't a huge trip for me because I'm not a type A person, right? I'm okay with waiting, and but if you are a person who is really you know, has a hard time when people don't get back to you on email right away, or feel like this is my oldest son, right? If my professor didn't get back to me within 2 days, then he's not doing his job, that kind of a thing. When you're working with Indigenous people, if they don't get back to you, they might not be interested, right? That goes back to treaties, right? If people didn't show up to vote, that's a vote. And so just kind of relearning how we interact with people. There's people I've been connecting with all year who are part of my research, but I don't do research with them. I reach out to see how they're doing, right? Because that's the relationship you have to cultivate in those spaces.
Yeah. Lastly, you know, the one example was the individual needed work collaboration with a tribal community for the purpose of their dissertation or thesis, I can't recall at this time, and decided to reach out and try to get these connections, and the entire time kept saying, I need them to get back to me. I need them to do this because, like, I can't, you know, I can't defend my dissertation. I can't complete my dissertation without this piece. and that what was a sense of urgency for you is not the community's problem. And so treating those communities as a subject of your research is the first step in knowing it will not work out well.
So this is more of a long-term investment. Like if you're going to work with Indigenous communities, you better be in for the long haul, because those interpersonal relationships are so important and a part of the community model. So I think that was very well said, and thank you for shedding some light on that, because these respectful practices are so important to learn for young researchers who are looking to work with Indigenous communities, because that start of that relationship really defines the narrative for the research that you will always be doing, right? So there's another question in the chat, and this is coming from an Indigenous student. Do you have any advice for Indigenous students who want to do research within their own community? How do I protect myself from fatigue, trauma, and being exploited by others, or using the lens of a Western research to exploit my own community?
Well, you're asking the right questions. I mean, huge questions.
Yeah, that's a lot. Yeah. Well, so as a doctoral student, I had to advocate for myself so often in the research. When I would attempt to use, I guess for the sake of this conversation, an Indigenous lens, discuss it through not this Eurocentric or, Western view of education, I had a great deal of pushback. And so what I learned was often it's really easy to advocate for someone else, but it's not always easy to advocate for yourself. And so I first, especially since the institution that I was at didn't have, a center or somewhere that was specific to Indigenous people, I had to seek out mentors for all of my identities, right? So like a woman that I trusted as a mentor who helped me get through that process, Indigenous, whether they were relatives or people doing the work. So I first sought out the guidance of mentors and had to learn that I have to always advocate for myself. That, unfortunately, during that research, stalled my research after year one, and I had to find and advocate for myself to get a new dissertation chair that would allow that process to happen. So I think definitely seek out and find individuals that you feel could help you in that process of advocating for yourself, to ensure all of those things that don't happen, but also remembering it's okay to have those emotions, right? Like we are going to feel those, especially if we're doing the work relative to our communities and the pain and the trauma that happened. They're real, they're relevant, they're important, but also always find time to have self-care. That could look many ways. That could be counseling. That could be a friend that you engage with weekly outside of work, out of school. Find every way that you can to ensure that you're taking care of yourself and that you are finding those individuals and that support systems that can help you through those processes.
Yeah, I don't know, follow up to that.
I think that's so important, and to reflect back on the research that Dr. Bassett and I were doing. It really started as self-care. Going to that workshop was self-care. I remember it very clearly. I was there with my best friend who traveled all the way from Michigan to come see Joy Harjo with us, because we were collaborating on a program with her. But what my point is here is finding research subjects and narratives that'll bring you joy, especially to Indigenous researchers. I know that having to kind of balance with that trauma is especially hard. So When we started that project, I had no prior knowledge of quill working, and that was something that was lost. And that was very traumatic to me. And so being able to take on this traumatic narrative in a more creative space where we can relearn this skill or language through crafting, I feel personally, that's how you start to tackle some of those harder topics, by starting with something that makes you happy, but also remembering the trauma that you're trying to work through as you're feeling connected to your project. So it doesn't look like we have any more questions in the chat. I'll allow for a few more seconds in case there's a few stragglers out there. But do you have any closing words that you would like to leave our students and our audience with?
I would like to say to any of those students who are feeling those same concerns that I'd be happy to share my contact information if they want to discuss further, if they want to vent, if they need support. We support all Indigenous students regardless if they're at SDSU or not. So yeah, ditto. Yeah.
Well, at this time, I would like to thank Dr. Bassett and Dr. Moore for joining us today for this panel. Your words were very insightful and very inspiring. I'm just, even though I've worked with you both in the past, every experience with you is a learning experience. And so it was my honor and pleasure to be able to interview today. Sorry, I'm reading the chat, trying to get instructions. So I know that they can't see you and you can't see them, but if you all could please do a silent round of applause for Dr. Bassett and Dr. Moore. They can definitely feel it right here in their heart space. Again, we're so appreciative for you to be able to share your narratives and your research and your expertise and guidance with our students at Northern Michigan University today. So on behalf of the Center for Native American Studies and the McNair Scholars Program, I would like to say miigwech. Thank you very much for joining us today. And we hope that you all have a great evening. Pamapi.
Home for having me. Thank you.